And John, you're going to put the URL for the group notes into the live stream chat, I presume? Good morning. Welcome to Connected Learning TV. Today we've got Joe Kahn, Cathy Cohen, and a whole host of respondents. We're going to be talking about the relationship between online participatory practices and political participation, particularly among youth. So we've got Dr. Cathy J. Cohen. She's the David and Mary Winton Green Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago and the founder of the Black Youth Project and author of The Boundaries of Blackness and Democracy Remixed. Her research focuses on political engagement by marginal communities. And Dr. Joseph Kahn is chair of the Digital Media and Learning Research Hub's Youth and Participatory Politics Research Network, and is the John and Martha Davidson Professor of Education at Mills College. His research focuses on ways school practices and new media influence youth civic and political development. So before we have Cathy and Joe talk, I would like to have our panel of respondents briefly introduce themselves. So why don't we start with you, Antero?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Antero Garcia. I'm an assistant professor at Colorado State University, and until last month, I was a high school English teacher in South Central Los Angeles.
Barry?
Hi, I'm Barry Joseph. I'm here in New York City, where I direct the online leadership program at Global Kids, an after-school educational organization. Happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Greg McVary. I'm an assistant professor at Southern Connecticut State University, and this is my second Connected Learning TV experience, and they've been great every time.
And Sam?
I'm Sam Boyer. I'm a traditional organizer turned software engineer. I've been working with the Occupy movement since the beginning of October as part of the Tech Ops group. I live here in New York City, so part of the original occupation, and I, in addition to working on general projects with them, have been working on a large new kind of social platform designed to facilitate long-term movement building. So very tied in with all the themes being dealt with in this in the report.
So this is going to be pretty rich. Let's get to it. Joe, do you want to start off, and then Cathy, and then we'll see what our respondents have to say.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity. Is that coming through okay? Super. So we're looking forward to sharing some findings from our report, Participatory Politics, New Media and Youth Political Action, and then to having the discussion. And if you're interested, a copy of the report can be found at the website yppdmlcentral.net. First, just some basics. We think this is the largest survey so far of youth in the U.S. that examines both civic and political engagement online and has detailed measures of other forms of digital practices. So one of our big goals is to examine the relationship between those two domains. In addition, this survey includes large samples of white, Black, Latino, and Asian youth, so we can talk with a good bit of confidence about each of those populations as well as about youth overall. Cathy and I were the co-principal investigators, and we worked closely with a team of researchers, Ben Boyer, Chris Evans, Ellen Middaugh, and John Rogowski. Our goal was to understand the ways that youth are using new media to engage politically, and also to see how these practices relate to a wide range of ways that youth engage with social media. There are many, of course, examples recently of youth using new media. Probably the clearest and most profound occurred during the Arab Spring, but we see many examples in the US as well. Molly Catchpole, for example, organized an online petition through change.org that led Bank of America to cancel its plan to have a $5 debit card fee after tens of thousands said they'd close their Bank of America accounts. The Stop Online Piracy Act was all set to pass until online activists, many of whom were young people, mobilized to stop it. And as we'll hopefully hear more about during this discussion, the Occupy movement drew heavily on digital media as part of their strategy. Those are just some of the examples, but it leaves many questions for us. For example, we want to know, are many youth engaged with these activities, or is it just a subsection of a small subsection of highly activated youth? Are different groups of youth equitably engaged? How does this engagement relate to broader and more common social media practices? Those are all some of the big questions that we talk about in our study and we'll talk about today. In addition, we know that in 2008, youth, and especially youth of color, were heavily engaged online in ways related to the presidential campaign, and we want to consider what we might expect in 2012. And finally, and I think very important for us given our focus on youth and on learning, what kinds of supports and infrastructure are needed to best support the development of young people as they engage civically and politically while employing these new technologies. So, what did we learn? Well, the first big finding is hardly a surprise. Youth are connected, and all groups of youth that we looked at were connected. If we take a look at the bottom line here of this slide, we see that, you know, in the 90s, youth have access to a computer that connects to the internet, and many youth have access to a wide range of technologies that allow them to employ digital media. As I mentioned, we're interested in the ways youth use social media in non-political domains, so we can consider how those practices relate to political practices. And as this chart shows, many youth are engaged with friends through social networks. We also looked at interest-driven participation. This conceptualization grows out of work by Mimi Ito, and her colleagues, as well as Henry Jenkins and the colleagues he works with at USC. And these research groups have identified ways that many youth participate in communities tied to interests in, for example, sports or entertainment or hobbies. And what we see is that rates of interest-driven participation are slightly lower than rates of friendship-driven participation, but still quite high. Overall, 64% participate in at least one form of interest-driven participation in a given week. And here's why we're interested. We want to see whether those who participate in friendship-driven networks and participate in interest-driven communities are more likely to participate civically and politically. So drawing on work by Henry Jenkins and Mimi Ito and others, we hypothesize that the participatory skills and networks and norms that youth develop in these largely non-political domains, in the friendship-driven participation or in the interest-driven participation, may foster a kind of digital social capital that ultimately supports their political engagement, something we describe as participatory politics. And Cathy will share some thoughts about that.
Okay. So like Joe, I also want to thank folks for joining us and for engaging in this conversation. I think here we really want to highlight the possibility of participatory politics as it's associated with the digital social capital. We understand participatory politics, as it's seen in the slide, to be largely interactive, peer-based, not guided by deference to elites or formal institutions, and therefore providing young people and all those with a bit more agency in terms of the creation of materials and engagement in the political process. So let's go to the next slide. Participatory politics, we believe, also facilitates a type of voice and influence, and I think it's important for us to emphasize that we're not collapsing the ideas between voice and influence. We are clear that it provides for usually more voice, and we're interested in the ways in which we can build infrastructure and supports to leverage that voice and to influence. It has certain attributes that we think are distinctive and important. It allows, for example, young people to reach large audiences and to mobilize their networks. It provides, again, a sense of agency so that they can shape their own agendas and engage in a dialogue with political leaders and not be subject to the desires and the leadership only of political elites. And it provides for a level of creativity through the creation of new material and the circulation of information that they're concerned with. Next slide, and I don't see the slide anymore. I can't see the slides. Can everyone else see the slides?
It showed up for a moment and then it left the screen.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll try to pull it back up. 1 sec.
Okay, here we are. So if people can see, hold on, we'll see if Joe can get that up. Make it a little bigger.
Is that good?
Perfect, thanks, Joe.
Okay.
The one thing that we want to emphasize here is that participatory politics is an important dimension of the political lives of young people. We know that young people, especially in 2008, went to the polls in record numbers. We see 41% said that they voted or intended to vote. We know that they're engaged in some forms of other political activities, but participatory politics, on average, merits about the same activity from young individuals. So let's go to the next slide. So participatory politics, there are kind of two things here that we want to pay attention to, and it might be a little confusing. Is that first, that friendship-driven participation is not necessarily related to participatory politics after we control for other factors. Some of that has to do with that those types of interactions are largely more insular, and so it doesn't really provide the type of information or motivation for political engagement. But it's also important to note that interest-driven participation is in fact strongly related to participatory politics and to other institutional politics. We find that young people who are engaged in interest-driven participation are 5 times more likely to engage in participatory politics, and they are 4 times more likely to engage in institutional politics. So participatory politics in many ways, interest-driven participation in many ways is associated with political engagement and might be seen as a pathway to that type of political engagement. We lost the slides again, I think.
Are they coming back?
Not yet. Hi, Jill. We see you, but not the slides.
But you're not seeing the slides? Let me try. I'll try one more time. Okay, 1 sec.
Now we see me. Hello.
Is that it?
That's better. Great.
And is that the slide you're on?
Yeah. I don't remember what slide we were on. I think we were right after interest-driven participation. Do you want me to find it?
Yeah, that's the one right after.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I apologize. It's dropping me off the Hangout.
That's just all right. Here we just want to kind of compare online and offline participatory politics, and I think there's an important point that we just kind of need to put on the table, which is for the most part, young people are not engaged in most kind of formal acts of participation as well as participatory politics. And so we have to kind of think about how do we increase participation in general. But again, what you see here is on average, those kind of indicators of participatory politics are getting the same type of take-up and sometimes more than offline participatory politics. So there's offline participatory politics and online participatory politics. So let's go to the next slide. Now, I'm going to just spend a few minutes here and we'll go pretty quickly, but I think one of the important components of participatory politics is the kind of equitable kind of distribution across race and ethnic groups. And we really want to kind of highlight that importance. So when we ask young people and we look at the data on participating in at least one form of participatory politics, what we find is that there's barely any difference between the type of engagement we see from white youth versus black youth. And then there's a bit of a decline when we look at Latino youth and Asian American youth. And something we'll point to later is that, thanks Joe for going to the next slide, is that actually when we look at online participatory politics, those acts that we're probably most interested in, we see that African American and in some cases Asian American young people tend to be engaged in those types of activities on par and sometimes slightly more than other groups. So something like forwarded or posted someone else's political commentary or news item, which is the second item here, you see a higher percentage or higher engagement among African Americans. The fourth item here, commented on a news story, again, you see a higher engagement among African American youth. And then the final item here, you see a kind of equal engagement among white, Black, and Asian American youth. Let's go to the next slide. Now, this is the distinction we want to make again. When thinking about participatory politics, what we found is white youth tend to be engaged more in offline participatory politics, taking part in a protest, engaging in a boycott. And again, African American and in some cases Asian American youth are more engaged in online participatory politics. Next slide. Finally, I think we want to point to kind of the overall political disengagement or engagement among young people. When we take into account both institutional politics, voting, and participatory politics, we find that Black youth or African American youth are actually the most involved or the least disengaged. And at the other end of the spectrum, we find that Asian American and Latino youth tend to be the most disengaged. Now, clearly, some of that has to do with, for example, restrictions on voting due to citizenship, and we would want to pay attention to that. We'd also, though, want to begin to think about how do we provide, again, supports and infrastructure to increase the engagement of Asian American and Latino youth. And here, I think I'll turn it back over to Joe.
Thanks, Cathy. So I think I'll just say a little bit about the ways in which new media, political information flow through participatory channels. So the first finding from our survey is that many youth get their news through participatory channels. You'll see that the most common source of news is TV or radio, but still tweets and Facebook posts from family and friends are giving about 45% of young people are getting news through their family and friends, tweets and Facebook posts, which is roughly the same percentage as are getting news and information through newspaper and magazines. And then in addition, there are things like online community discussion, and that's actually online community discussion through non-political interest-driven networks focused, communities focused on hobbies or sports or entertainment. So there's a lot of relatively unmediated access to news and information coming through participatory channels. Some people have worried, given that there would be many people who are getting news only, say, through Facebook or Twitter, and aren't getting news through traditional sources, and we find that really isn't the case for a substantial number of youth. So about half of all youth, 49%, are getting news once a week from traditional sources as well as from participatory sources. A little more than a quarter of youth are only getting news and information on societal issues through traditional sources. Very few youth, just 4%, reported getting news through participatory channels and not through traditional sources or broadcast sources. And perhaps of more concern, 19% reported getting no news, none at all, on societal issues, political, civic, etc., during the prior week. So we have a fairly sizable number there that's self-reporting that they are disengaged from information on news and societal issues. Another big question is the issue of credibility, especially given how much youth are getting news through participatory channels. We asked them, would people like you and your friends benefit from learning more about how to tell if news and information you find online is trustworthy? And 84% said yes. And as I think we'll talk about during the discussion, there's just a big need for both digital infrastructure as well as supports with media literacy, both in school programs and in extracurricular activities, as well as in through other dynamics, to really support young people and frankly all of us in being better able to tell whether the news and information we find online is trustworthy. So then I'll shift it back to Cathy for some conclusions and implications.
Sure. I'll just take 1 minute and just kind of run through what we understand to be both the possibilities and I would say some of the challenges associated, at least with this initial report and our initial work around participatory politics. We think that, in fact, it has the idea of participatory politics has a great potential for engaging young people, because it, in many ways, and this is the second point, is already a kind of part of their social lives. So we're not asking them necessarily to do something different. We're asking them to extend what they're already engaged in. We also understand that participatory politics is already a significant component of their political lives. And again, as Joe said, it's not displacing institutional politics, but in many ways supplementing institutional politics. It is a form of political engagement that is relatively equitably distributed, different from other forms of institutional politics, in particular voting. It doesn't come with the restrictions, for example, of citizenship or registering to vote. And so there are many positives, we think, to kind of a pursuit for understanding participatory politics. That said, there are also real challenges. First of all, young people will need support, as Joe just said, in understanding what is credible information. They will need infrastructure that will kind of tap into what they're already doing in their social lives and transfer those skills and that knowledge into their participatory politics or political lives. And we think it has great possibility for expanding the democracy. But we want to have a real, hopefully, vibrant discussion about the possibilities. We don't want to say this is all positive. We want to think critically about how to move forward. So I think we can end here and listen to the respondents.
Okay, so who wants to respond to that? Jump on in.
I just want to first say thank you for this information. I was really excited as I've read through it. To me, what I really hear are a couple of red flags for teachers and schools in terms of this information. As I think about what civics education looks like in most public schools today, it's typically, a one-semester course that students take at the end of the school when they have senioritis, and they're just trying to, get their diploma in the last couple months of school. And to me, this really speaks to the fact that civics education is happening for kids from day one, but usually outside of schools, right? And I'm not trying to make an argument here that we need to replace that within schools and tell kids this is where civic education happens, but that the tools that students could be gaining in schools should be augmenting what participatory politics look like, right? There's a big need for critical media literacy, and I'm sure that'll probably emerge from this conversation, I'm hoping, around how are we going to give kids the tools to, as you mentioned, understand what material is trustworthy online, but also how to be somebody who is seen as trustworthy too, right? That it's much more of a two-way street when we think about participatory politics. And so I think one of the things that I'm interested in kind of thinking through today is how does this information funnel into teacher pedagogy, right? And into the ways schools and teachers are supporting the type of work that is happening outside of schools most of the time. So thank you guys, I appreciate it.
So, go.
As someone who works in the after school and the informal learning spaces, one of the things from the report that I find most thrilling is the connection you guys found, which I think is somewhat surprising but great to hear about, between non-political interest-driven activities and how it's somewhat of a gateway drug to participatory politics. In our work here at Global Kids, we want our youth to be civically engaged as part of what it means for us to develop their identity as global citizens. And sometimes the programs we might do with digital media, where the youth are producing a video game about a social issue or a piece of animation, I'm sometimes frustrated because I don't feel like it's as activist as I want it to be. But now I can hear that having the youth focus on these interest-driven activities can help move them along and provide a scaffolding, an educational scaffolding, to get them down the road to be more involved in participatory politics. Am I understanding what you guys are your findings correctly? And if so, do we know anything more about why we think that that connection exists and how those like us who are working in the after-school space can support those interest-driven activities and make those connections for them to the participatory political actions they can later take?
So, Barry, just to jump in quick on your point, I think we don't know for sure, and this is obviously something we want to study in much greater depth, but I do think that we see strong indications that young people are developing networks through their interest-driven activities. They're learning skills that fit very appropriately and are very similar to the skills you need for online activity, and they're getting a sense of how powerful networks can be, and the kinds of norms that allow them to be effective. So there are lots of things young people are picking up through these networks, as well as just access to being mobilized, that allow that kind of those non-political dimensions of activity online to become a pathway to much more participatory politics.
So can I jump in here too? Sorry, Barry. That I think there are still some questions that I know we want to pursue, and I'm sure lots of other people want to pursue. So what types of interest-driven activities tend to facilitate more participatory or institutional politics? What are the kind of distinctive forms of the skills that young people are acquiring through interest-driven activities, and how do those transfer into the political realm? I mean, in many ways, it's thought to kind of parallel the literature in political science about the skills people learn in places like churches that allow them to allow them to be kind of more politically active in institutional politics. So I think greater clarity in terms of digging down with regards to kind of the specific relationships and skills and norms that they're picking up in interest-driven activity would allow us to provide you with better information about how to kind of structure your programs to lead to the outcomes that you want.
Thank you. That's really useful. I mean, I can certainly see how working with the youth to develop critical thinking skills about information they find online, having them think about the ethics of what it means to have a public voice. These are things that we might not be thinking about from our perspective as being inherent tools that they might use for being for participating in political activities online and participatory politics in specific, but I can see now how those become essential tools that they will be required to have later on, and this can be the beginning of a process for them to build up that toolkit that they can use when that moment arrives.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to hop on that when I saw that statistic about the the interest-driven politics. That's what caught me, because I think we need more of that in schools, interest-driven learning, and it seems we're going further from that direction as students get less and less control over the text that they choose. And I think later we'll return to that fact that 84% of students want more learning around teaching credibility, because we have to look at these texts, these political activist texts. I kind of call them socially complex texts, because they're opposing viewpoints, different levels of amplification and authority, and they're just not being taught in schools. And I found those are the two things that I'm going to really take away from today, that interest-driven participation it influences political participation later, and then that the kids are begging for us to teach them more media skills. So I think those are two powerful takeaways.
I had a question and then kind of comments. I wanted to ask about, so you started Molly Catchpole earlier and the petition that you started on change.org to fight against the $5 debit card thing that Bank of America instituted. And one of the things that I've observed, at least anecdotally, is that much of the online political engagement that's set up right now tends to be more bounded and part of a predefined, somewhat predefined goals. And in the case of Molly Catchpole, it's relatively easy for everyone to have a quick and immediate reaction to the fact that a $5 debit card charge was added. So, and in the study, you point out that online engagement doesn't necessarily translate to the kind of engagement that is necessary to support longer-term social movements and more prolonged engagement. So I'm curious, even if you just got an anecdotal sense from over the course of the study, if there were some particular things that prevented online engagement as it's happening right now from translating to more permanent connections. And actually, I'll save the comment for later. I'll leave it at the question.
Well, I'll jump in just very quickly. A lot of what we do politically, whether it's online or offline, doesn't always transfer into social movement activity, and I know this is an interest of yours, Sam, right? So social movement activity, and at least the mobilization as we know it, is often bounded in networks that people join and sustain that type of political activity because other people have vouched for this, their friends are there. These are issues that they feel deeply. There are other supports that allow them to engage in that type of politics. And oftentimes, people have engaged in other forms, more immediate or temporary forms of political engagement, where they received a win or something like that, and understand the significance and the benefit and the possibility. So I think, again, in thinking about, I think as Barry talked about, as a gateway drug to social movement activity, we might say some of the participatory politics that provide for immediate wins. I mean, as an organizer and as someone, as an activist myself, you know kind of the significance of giving people a win in terms of, getting them engaged and getting them to kind of buy into the importance of politics and even sustain politics. I think we're thinking of participatory politics as that possibility. It provides people, again, with a level of agency they just haven't had before, or at least haven't always had before. It's more equitably distributed. The possibility of kind of immediate wins, the possibility of feeling like they led to the immediate win, they just weren't a member at a rally. And so it seems to me that those types of experiences provide a foundation for an easier mobilization for the kind of long-term deep ties that are needed for certain types of social movement activity. Last thing I'll say is, also in social movement activity, there are the need for deep ties, people who are there for a long time, that's usually a core. But there's a need for kind of people with weak ties who might be there, who might be at Occupy for a week initially and may never show up again, but may give money later. So it seems to me that the participatory politics and interest-driven activity we're talking about could lead to multiple pathways to the type of sustained social movement activity that you're talking about.
Sure, absolutely. You need all manner and kind of different types of events in order to get people involved, and depending on where they are and the scope of their engagement, their availability of time, absolutely. I don't disagree with that at all. Dovetailing from that, so on the credibility question, it's one of the fundamental problems that we have had inside of Occupy, I would say, is one of the things that I jumped on when I read the report was this: we need how to better understand the credibility of the sources that are coming to us. So I was hoping to hear a little bit more about, you put one question up on the PowerPoint, and I don't know if you asked any more questions about credibility, but for us, the issue is not so much is this information kind of accurate in a traditional news provider consumer type sense. It was somewhat internal. I mean, as much as internal movement communication is internal, how do we understand that this message that's come out of this group from over here in San Francisco is something that we should pay attention to here in New York or whatever? It's some sense of understanding the context that the message was produced. So I mean, I jumped onto this question of credibility because that's one of the things that's really troubled us. So did you do how much further investigation did you do on that credibility question beyond that one question that you put up on the PowerPoint?
So I'll jump in just for a sec, just to say, I mean, we did a bit of looking at it, and we're going to actually probably release some additional sort of data points on this down the road. But I think one important qualification, which I think is highlighted by your comment, and I think also by your earlier question, which is to say the credibility item stands as a proxy for a whole set of media literacy skills. Some of those skills are about the consumption of information. Some of them are about the production of information. If we need kids to be able to, upload a video, they may know how to do that already. But if we want them to upload a compelling and thoughtful video, they may need they may be able to benefit from help. Certainly, educational institutions, after-school programs like the kind of thing Barry is talking about are one piece of that puzzle. One thing we did ask about is where youth are getting supports for this sort of stuff, and we find that a lot of this is coming through their friends, that they are providing help to one another, that their parents help, that their siblings help. In other words, I don't think we want to understand the only sources coming from formal institutions, but clearly some of the opportunities come from formal institutions. We asked about, for example, the ability of young people to detect bias, which I think gets a little bit to some of the issues that you're talking about, sort of understanding where the sources of these information are. And again, there's a high percentage of young people who want help with that. So I think there is some hunger for it and some recognition of the need for it. schools are beginning to recognize that, but I think, you know, as educational institutions move slowly, I think the educational institutions are behind where the young people are on this one.
If I could actually if somebody would just hand me a grant for a lot of money, what I'd love to do is really kind of embed this kind of credibility learning into an environment where students have to participate in online role playing. You could have a mixture of like interactive think alouds where, you know, somebody brings their perspective and their biases to reading a source from San Francisco or from something. So the students would have to interact in some kind of online role playing environment where they meet other agents who then read sources that are biased and say, oh, well, look what this person said. That can't be true because this study's nonsense. They're all, you know, and then they would have to interact and then within those roles yet. But I don't have the few $1 million to set it up yet, but hopefully someday. But I really think that there's the only way to, when we study credibility and we decontextualize it every time, and you can't get it biased in decontextualized environments. You need, yeah. I know that's kind of fake what I'm suggesting because it isn't totally contextualized, but at least there's an effort to try it, because every time I see anybody give a kid a checklist of credibility skills, the kids just make errors of oversimplification. Oh, this is credible, it's got every period. Or this is credible, it's .org. They make errors of oversimplification, and they do not get at how point of view shapes the images and words that we use on a page. Simple design elements, like why is this persuasive website using the color red, where this other website, this more informative one, uses a lot more white and negative space. There's so much involved in it that it'd be, oh good, Antero's giving me $1 billion to study it. So thank you, Antero, I'll get on that. So I think schools do need to catch up. You're absolutely correct.
Also, I would add, as a proponent of crap detection, that using search as a way to think like a detective and look to see if there's an author for sites and look to see what others have to say about that author. There's just, I think, a couple of simple things could be taught that would help things a lot in regards to credibility testing. I do have a question from the live stream here for anybody, which is, do engaged youth participate more in international projects as well? Anybody?
I think we may have a little bit of information on this, but we don't have any analysis at this point on that question. I think we do know that the young people who are in general doing participatory politics are also doing institutional politics, and so that's an important piece of it. But I don't know if we know whether or not they're doing international stuff. Oh, maybe Barry has some thoughts.
Yeah, I'm looking at the live stream. I think the question was specifically about international subjects, which of course at Global Kids, it's always international. We try and make sure that the youth, when they're developing any form of digital media, that the content is around something global. So for example, next Monday we're going to have the launch of one of our summer camps where the youth will be making an animated movie using a type of animation called machinima, where they use a video game to make the movie, and the topics can be all about global sustainability. Often when young people come into the program, we don't find that necessarily they're there because of the issue. They're there because they want to have fun, they want an opportunity to connect with the adults, their peers, with the technology, they want to express themselves, they want to make a difference. But when we work with the young people and we listen to them and we give them an opportunity to notice things that are going on in their immediate environment, in the world around them here in New York, and then understand how their personal experience of it is something that can connect them with what other young people are experiencing around the world, they then start becoming aware of these global issues as well, and they have a personal connection to it. So for us at Global Kids, it's very core to our model that working with young people and help them develop that identity as global citizens and see what they're experiencing here is something that can be a vantage point for them to understand what's going on around the world, becomes a really key motivator by the end of the program to keep them engaged in the project and doing the kind of nitty-gritty work that's going to be quite tedious often unless you have that passion and interest to keep engaged with, making that movie, for example. So for us, that ability to connect with international and global issues is really key for us to develop that interest-driven component and support that and kind of fan those flames amongst the youth in our programs.
Great answer, thanks.
I was intrigued by something Joe mentioned a little bit ago, that the overlap between those engaged with participatory politics and those engaged with institutional politics, and also made me think back to some of the data you shared earlier about that gap of, I think it was 19% of youth who aren't getting any news at all, right, from either online means or traditional means. And I was really interested in trying to think through what counts as participation, right? So, and who's counting it also. So if I'm engaged in making a YouTube video around Coney, right, which is a very big international type of issue, that's not something that's probably going to help me get into an Ivy League college if that's something in terms of building towards social capital in the future. But it might help me get more buy-in in terms of an interest-driven network in the future, right? I'm interested in, you know, what is the connect between these two different types of engagement? And if it's the same demographic kind of participating in both, what does that say about the students who aren't participating? And I guess I'm just curious if there's more development around this idea, and more thinking around this idea.
Well, I'll take the first try at this, and then Joe can chime in. You know, I think one of the important things for us was, first of all, to underscore or to kind of push back on the idea that if we expand the realm of participatory politics, it means that then young people will stop participating in what's thought to be the more important politics, where there's a clear line to power, something like voting or institutional politics. So we thought it was important, first of all, to look at if there is a displacement. And in fact, what we found is there's a supplement, that young people who are engaged in participatory politics tend also to be involved in institutional politics. So one of the things you might expect is that these are young people who are kind of highly interested in politics, who have learned a set of skills, who are able to kind of transfer those skills both in the online or new media framework or area, as well as the more institutional politics. Now, who decides what counts as politics? I mean, this is, I think, part of what is really maybe exciting about participatory politics, because suddenly when you say making a Coney video on YouTube won't get you into an Ivy League school. Well, first of all, it probably will get you into an Ivy League school, right? They would. Now, making a rap video, they might not put you into an Ivy League school, but it might be still the same skills learned in terms of making a video and uploading it to YouTube that allow you also to kind of remash an Obama speech and make a politically commentary, a video that has political commentary. And we would count that as a form of political engagement. It might not be the direct kind of institutional engagement that political scientists usually look at, but we think, in fact, it is either a pathway to that institutional politics or a form of, at the very least, political expression that has to be noted and that might sway the opinions of one's network. And so it should be counted as some form of political participation. So I think what we're trying to do is kind of expand the realm of what counts as politics, to understand that young people are kind of finding new ways to create new forms of politics that either stand on their own, but sometimes also connect with more institutional politics. That we're not surprised that at this point, young people who are probably more interested and more politically efficacious are the ones involved in both participatory politics and institutional politics. And I think the question becomes, what are the skills, and again, what are the supports and infrastructure that we need to build and provide that allow those young people who might be engaged in a kind of participatory culture, but not in politics, to transfer those skills into the political realm, even if it's temporary.
Thanks, Cathy. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And I think what you're talking about kind of highlights one of the reasons why your report is not only so important, but it continues from a number of the reports that we've seen, from things like the Hamago report, the hanging out, messing around, geeking out. That's essentially saying here, these are activities that are not invisible to us. We see them. We know that they're going on, but we now have a way to frame them and value them, both for ourselves as adults and educators and policymakers, and more importantly, I would say, for young people who are participating in these activities, to understand that these are not only things that are fun for them, but valuable, that they need to have language to describe those value and be able to realize that there are times when there's opportunities like applying to colleges or looking for jobs or participating in the civic sphere, where they get to show others that they have these skills and they have these abilities, and these are things they can aspire to have, and it should admire amongst both others and then those who are already successful in the public sphere as role models.
I have a question from the chat that I think is relevant here, which is what about the digital divide where kids of different ethnic groups and lower income get different types of informal training on media use than mainstream higher income youth?
Well, I'll say a bit about this, and I think Joe might want to jump in because he's in fact done this research on the difference in for example, civic education. In this report, we really tried to, as Joe talked about, structure our survey so that we had adequate numbers of a range of young people to talk about the different trajectories with regards to new media and participatory politics across race and ethnicity. As we talk about in the report, you know, a lot of the early discussion of the digital divide really focused on access. And we know that increasingly the kind of divide in access is being minimized, if not going away. Young Blacks and Latinos are accessing the internet through mobile technology. Whites and Asian Americans tend to be accessing the internet through laptop computers, but everyone seems to have access. There's still the question of broadband access that we can continue to debate, but part of what we found is that young Blacks in particular, but young Blacks, Asian Americans, were engaged more often in friendship-driven activities. They were more often engaged in interest-driven activities, and they dropped off a bit when it came to participatory politics. And I think this is an interesting moment when we talk about kind of media literacy and the ability to not only have voice but influence. Here we have a possibility for young people of color who often have been silenced and thought to be on the kind of bad side or the low side of the digital divide, to be redefining at least some of the kind of political realm with regards to online participatory politics. This is a possibility for us to amplify their voice, but also amplify their influence. And so for me, and I think for Joe also, this is a really exciting possibility about kind of pushing the boundary of who gets to engage in the democratic process moving forward, especially based on kind of through new media and participatory politics.
Yeah, I'll jump in just quick to, I mean, I completely agree with what Cathy just said. I think there are a couple things that are really exciting and important about this. One is that we see high levels of participation on the part of all groups of young people, and that the more flexibility and the more open it is for different groups to decide how involved they want to get, the more equitable the engagement is. When schools decide who gets what, we see more inequality. And I think one of the challenges is that since some of the forms of digital literacy and supports for civic engagement in general come through educational institutions, that while it's helpful in the sense that it can reach all kids, it also can promote inequality because some people are much more engaged in school. Obviously, some drop out of school, some go to college, some don't. And for example, at the level of college, we see high levels of inequality between those who are in college and their participation rates and those who are not in college and their participation rates. So we need to address those things. And as Cathy said, we have an opportunity here because if we tie into what young people are interested in and to their friendship-driven networks, we may well have opportunities to reach youth who otherwise wouldn't be reached. And in fact, they're reaching out on their own and are getting involved. So this gives us a leverage point for boosting engagement.
We also have access, if we can get more unfettered use of the internet, to reach every single student's interests. As kids can actually start to build text first on their own interest, and then followed by, you know, maybe into some forms of political engagement. Going back a few years now, when we were working on a study in some of in urban classrooms, it was during the 2008 election, and you know what, it was a great time to be teaching kids how to use the internet. Like one of the lessons we did was I think Hillary Clinton accused Barack Obama of plagiarizing one of like Patrick Duvall's speeches, and so we gave him this inquiry question like, was this plagiarism? And it was to really teach kids to read multiple texts at the same time, and then it culminated into their own research and inquiry projects. I was amazed at the topics that the kids chose. You know, I was expecting a ton of why does a food cafeteria stink, or why can't I wear my hoodies? But what we found were a lot of the kids were doing topics on how do I stop dating violence? How can I keep my brother from a gang? They were choosing just giving them the opportunity to practice in current events as we model the skills. When the kids had their own choices, they were choosing real life topics that affected their everyday lives in their classroom learning. And I don't think we do enough of that in schools. I so fear that as all of our testing moves online, the access that our students of color are going to have is going to be dwindled and dwindled more and more until they're only using computers to raise their Lexile scores. And we're going to shut out generations of students from interest-driven learning. It's a big true fear I have.
Now, this is Cathy. I totally agree with the fear, but I guess I want to push back on a couple things. One is I think there's maybe a bigger concern. In the schools that I engage in, many of them charter schools, they've now kind of shut down access so that kids can get online, but they can't get online, you know, for YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, because in fact it's feared that they will only engage in kind of social unproductive activities on those spaces. So I think we also need to not explain, but we need to kind of share information and engage with teachers and administrators about the significance of allowing kids to be online. The second thing I would say is I think you're right. The kids need to be able to kind of drive their connected learning around the things that matter most in their lives. And so if a kid wanted to write something about why I can't wear my hoodie, for example, given the Trayvon Martin killing, we could understand the kind of political implications of that. And so to also, you know, restrain ourselves from thinking we have a clear sense of the important issues in their lives as opposed to the frivolous things that they might write about, because oftentimes they have a connection, I would argue, that we might not understand.
I just want to underscore one thing that I took away in my reading of the report, and that's that participatory politics isn't necessarily just tied to kids being online and things being digital, and unless I'm incorrect about that. And I think that's an important thing for educators to recognize, is that, you know, pulling into these interest-driven types of learning isn't about, you know, is the internet going to work, or is it too filtered on this day or that day? And I think those are really important, and that's something that really needs to be pushed in terms of a discussion with educators. But in terms of thinking about pushing what participatory politics looks like in schools, I think we can really start not worrying about, you know, does the internet suck at school today, because it always will, for them. At least right now in most urban schools right now, the internet's going to suck and it's going to be filtered and it's going to be really problematic. But that shouldn't be a deterrent from kids being engaged in participatory politics in ways that are mediated by teacher pedagogy and relationships with adults.
So I wonder if you guys had an opportunity to talk to a parent and then separately talk to a principal, what's the one or two sentences you'd want to tell them that are the key takeaways that they should get from your report that might change both the policies in their school or the rules in their household?
I'll jump in with two possibilities. So one would be that I think for the parents, we want people to recognize the potential power of interest-driven participation in allowing young people, you know, as I think we've all said, to explore their interests, even if those interests are not tightly tied to, say, the formal political process or to, say, narrow understandings of what it means to be academically engaged. That participating in online communities around hobbies, for example, can be quite powerful learning opportunities for young people. The second thing, and perhaps this is more on the principal side of the issue, is one, that the idea that we're going to get there without the internet or somehow we're going to stop that is both not going to happen and is a really bad defensive posture in terms of really preparing young people for the future. And that if we want to prepare young people for the future, we really have to focus both on the kinds of things around credibility and bias and how to understand where information is coming from on the consumption end, as well as prepare them to be thoughtful and ethical and compelling producers of information and circulators of information.
We've got about 5 minutes left, so anybody who's got something that they really want to make sure to say, now's a good time. It's been a pretty rich discussion. Don't let me throw a damper on it just because we're running towards the end here.
Well, if we don't have anything else, I do have one other question. It's kind of basic, but I'd like to at least briefly talk about the difference between, well, there's voice and then there's influence. And there's voice and influence in an offline context, and then voice and influence in an online context. And I was just hoping that you could talk a little bit about the difference between those differences. If that makes sense.
Sure. I mean, one of the things that has, I think, guided our writing of this report is really being clear that while we want to support the idea of amplification of young people's voices, we don't in any way equate voice with influence, and that to change kind of the conditions in young people's lives will take action both online and offline. It will take strategy. It will take the deployment of resources, and often it will be accomplished through kind of collective mobilization. We toyed with really focusing on the framework of power in the report, understanding that there is a significant role for voice to shape the dialogue, to provide information, to engage both with political elites but also with your network. But somehow that voice and dialogue and debate has to be turned into some type of form of action where you can wrest power or at least try to change policy. And I think what we're doing, trying to kind of communicate in the report, is the possibility clearly for the amplification of voice, but also for the foundation for mobilization towards power or towards influence. It's not clear yet, I think, in our research, the exact pathway to kind of power and influence as utilized for participatory politics. That is, we're going to go into the field and have yet another survey. We're going to do more, I think, smaller scale projects. We can really look at people utilizing participatory politics to change things other than, for example, an online petition or something like that. So I think we'll clearly have more to say, and we want to work with other people who can provide examples of using participatory politics for real powerful change and action. But we understand the distinction, and we understand that the model is there and needs to be filled in, and we're not equating the two.
Sure. And that's great. And I just wanted to bring it up mostly because one of the things that I've noticed is, like, as an internet engineer who works on this all the time, one of the things that folks who do not have my kind of job, or perspective they often don't have, is just how much of the internet is social dead space. And if people are going out and they're exploring their new political identities and they're expressing things into spaces where there is no response, or there's very sort of meager response, or there's just flaming responses, it's very, very discouraging. So there's but social cues work very differently online than out in person. So there's just this preponderance of spaces which do not end up supporting any kind of interaction that would encourage people. And so yeah, voice, it's much
advocating to people who are starting online projects of any kind with people, whether they're youth or not, who have not been involved before, is that if you're going to give people a voice, make sure that you line up some people to respond to them. There's nothing worse than dropping a pebble into the well and not hearing it plink. So it's, I think easy enough to make sure that you've got some people to respond. And I think the other side of that is that there's nothing that encourages further participation, in my experience, more than being responded to the first time you try something, particularly if someone responds to you by name. So we're at the top of the hour here. This has been a great session. I want to thank our guests and our respondents. And we've got another session coming up next week that will be equally interesting. We've got Andrew Slack on civic engagement insights from the Harry Potter Alliance. And that's going to be at 10 a.m. Pacific on July 10th, a week from today. So thank you all for joining us. It's been a great session. Please join the comment thread. This session will be archived at connectedlearning.tv, and we can continue the discussion in the comment thread there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe and Cathy. Thanks, Howard.